welcome back to the channel. Tiffany here, and I've got a little bit of a different video today. And this one, you may notice I have a bit of a friend in the background. Well, I kind of 3D printed a life-size version of myself. Yee! And in this video, I'm gonna go over the entire process from the start of scanning myself to getting that mesh and cutting it up and transforming it into a actual usable file that I then could print on my 3D printer and have a life-size version of myself. So yeah, but before again, remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of my tutorials. This right here is the main reason I wanted to make this. And this is just a few of the dress forms and the mannequins that I have in my house. And let's face it, I'm not these proportions and I'm not this height. And even when I got custom made dress forms and mannequins that were relatively kind of close, they just didn't quite work for me. And for me, being a full-time costume and prop maker, making tons of cosplays all year long, I'm tired of using all of this to get a basic pattern that I then have to alter to fit me. So for me, I'd rather have a life-size version of me that I can always get the correct size for all of my patterns. So the biggest goal for me for this project is 1, life-size version of me. 2, it has to be able to come apart so I can use each body section of the head, the mid area, the legs, and the arms just like a normal mannequin. So that way I can use it for putting clay on and sculpting for future projects, as well as just being able to make custom patterns on if I want to do the traditional saran wrap and masking tape version. And 3, I also just wanted a mesh version of myself, so that way when I end up doing more 3D models, I have a 2-scale version of me and not some random mesh version of some chick I found online. And 4, I want to be able to replace these heads with an actual 2-scale version of mine, because wig styling on this has been a pain, as well as on this. So having an actual 2-scale version of my own head will help with this. And for me, I had been wanting to scan myself for a really long time and was trying to go towards the more cheaper options of programming, starting with using the smartphone versions, starting off with my Pixel phone, but the problem with Pixel phones is they don't have the LiDAR software that is required for a lot of the scanning programs, and then tried it with the latest iPhone, which did have the LiDAR sensor, but in the end, all of these smartphone programs were using basic photogrammetry, which is basically just taking a ton of pictures of the object that you want to be scanned, and then it randomly will kind of put them together. But the problem was the end results were really not that usable. These programs were more focused on the smaller scale versions of objects and not a life-size body, which ended up bringing me towards the route of buying a scanner. And I went with purchasing the Creality CR-Scan Otter, and this one featured 8 infrared LEDs, 2 white LEDs, 4 stereo depth cameras, and 1 RGB camera. And this one worked perfectly for the amount of detail that I wanted for the mesh, as well as for a final 3D printed piece. And I'll note that the version I got was a wired one that had to be plugged into the computer in order to use, but there are other versions that are wireless, just at a higher price. And doing a full body scan was relatively easy and fast. It took around 3 minutes to do, with my spouse helping with holding the scanner as I stood on a turntable with a board on it so I could slowly rotate as he scanned me. And with the scan, you actually are doing it in Creality CR-Scan, which is their scanner software, and it's pretty easy to use. It basically, as you go, will show you live feed of what you are scanning, indications of if you need to change your distance to and from the object you are scanning. It'll go from green being good to red you need to adjust. And for doing a full body scan, ended up using their settings specifically for body with the geometry mode and high quality. And compared to everything else we had tried, this actually was pretty good, except for the face and the hands. So then I ended up doing another scan, specifically using their face setting this time, again with geometry mode and high quality, and it looked so much better in the end. And this ended up being the head part that I used for my final piece. Now for the hand though, that one gave quite a bit of difficulty just because it's really hard to have your hand be still and wide open enough to scan all the parts around. So I ended up adding a lot more of the included markers, and these really helped the scanner to increase accuracy when going around, especially on smooth surfaces. In the end, the hand still had a bit of issues on the fingertips, but compared to the first try, it was so much better, and I knew I was going to put this into another software later and fix all of this, so it was usable for what I needed. Now for editing the mesh to make it actually usable. And in total, I ended up with 3 separate files that each needed to be fixed. And I ended up using my go-to CAD program, which was Rhinoceros 6. Starting with the hands, where I ended up having to cut it at the wrist, so that way it was one flat surface. And in order to make it a closed mesh, I did have to do quite a bit of editing to make sure there was no manifold edges, no naked edges. I did have to go in manually and delete a lot of the faces and patch things up to make it usable, which I also repeated for both the head as well as the body scan. Then I imported everything into another program called Nomad Sculpt, and this one I was really able to go in and smooth out all of the pieces, any of the rough edges. I could smooth out all of the lines from the wig cap to the clips. For the ears on the head, there ended up being holes, so I was able to go in and patch that up. Then had to Frankenstein body parts together, and because I only scanned one hand, I ended up needing to mirror that to the opposite side. And I found this easiest to just cut off the arm and then attach it to one and then mirror it to the opposite side. However, when doing this process, I did have to go back and forth between Rhino and Nomad to smooth out the connection parts, as my hand to arm were in a slightly different positioning, so they didn't perfectly align. I also repeated this for attaching the head, cutting off the previous head on the full body scan and then replacing it with the new version. And last was engineering the lock and key part, which I ended up making in a circle piece with this little keyhole that it would insert into and offsetting everything. So that way, when I printed this piece separately, I would have enough clearance to glue this piece in afterwards. And the final thing was to segment the entire body to make sure it would fit on my printer bed, and it ended up being 12 separate parts. Now for printing and assembling, and printing was a really easy process. I ended up using my FDM printer, a Prusa XL, printing in PETG filament, as I wanted these to be relatively strong as I plan on working on this mannequin. And this process took a bit of time to do. In total, it took me 241 hours and 56 minutes to print a life-size version of myself. And for assembling all of the pieces together, I ended up using 2-part epoxy, pretty much gluing 1 or 2 pieces together a day, as it took up a bit of space. I will note that I did have a bit of issues when it came to gluing specifically the arm parts together, as it couldn't stand on itself. And I do wish when I designed the whole piece and segmented it, I had put a little post in between to help align the parts together. I had considered it, but I ended up just being lazy and not wanting to do it, and that would have made it a lot easier to make sure everything aligned, especially because the arm, making sure that it stayed in the correct angle when it didn't have an actual flat surface to stand on, it would have made that so much easier. Then after all of that was dry after 24 hours, I did end up gluing our last parts, which were the lock and key parts, specifically the lock section that was inserted into all of the connecting limb attachment parts, connecting them with epoxy and letting them dry another 24 hours. Now, because this is going to be a working form, I wasn't really concerned about having all of the printer lines. The only thing that I wanted to clean up was all of our glue seams. Just because I had applied so much, I wanted to make sure these pieces lasted and I had filled up that gap in between. And I just used a sanding buff, some sanding blocks, and that pretty much finished out this build. And one of the big goals that I had was to make sure each of the parts could come apart just like a mannequin. So I did end up designing all these little lock and keys in the connecting joints, and I'll show you now how I put it together. Good job, me! And that, guys, is how I 3D printed myself. And I hope you found this interesting and maybe informative on how you can do it yourself or how to not do it, whatever. But anyway, if you did find it useful, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, so leave a little message down below. As well as don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of my tutorials and what I'm making here on the channel. And a big thank you to all of my company sponsors here on YouTube, as well as all of my members, specifically those legendary members. So that way I can continue doing this as my full-time job and bring you more tutorials and costumes and props and things. So yeah, and I'll see you for our next video. Much love, guys.